the purpose of the Jewish people is for us to bring godliness into the world. And therefore it's not surprising that if our job is to bring the spiritual into the physical, we're going to be forced throughout our history to become a little bit detached, or a bit detached to the physical world, to physical existence.
Welcome back to JTV Podcast. Today we're going to discuss happiness, pleasure, optimism, pessimism. And is Judaism a religion of optimism or pessimism? So actually, before I get going, I want to ask you, based on that question alone, Ollie, would you describe Judaism as a pessimistic or optimistic religion?
I'd say Judaism is a thoroughly optimistic religion. Although I actually have a problem with the word religion when it comes to Judaism, but that's, for want of a better word, religion. Mm-hmm. Jews, on the other hand, not always. And that, by the way, goes all the way back to biblical times. You know,
you mean a wider thing than just classic English, the miserable attitude of English people combined with Judaism. I mean, it's a wider.
Yeah, no, I think a deep sense of angst.
Okay.
Runs deep through the Jewish veins, and there's many important spiritual and psychological reasons for that, which we can perhaps delve into and perhaps try to understand and see how it can be things can be addressed. But
explain to me why you call Judaism an optimistic religion in inverted commas.
As Rabbi Sachs said, Jews are the only people whose golden age is in the future. We await the messianic era where the world is at peace, where human beings understand the importance of being good, of valuing every single individual, of having a relationship with our Creator, of knowing the reason for our being. So we await that, and that hasn't yet come, and therefore built into the whole spiritual and psychological psyche of Judaism is that the world is heading in the right direction, whether we do anything about it or not. And our job is simply, do we want to play our part, our role in putting those building blocks on the building. So we're absolutely, convinced that the world is going to become perfect and whole and godly and good. And so it's not so much about what the ending will be, but what Judaism says you have the chance to play a role in that story. It's like when Esther talks to Mordecai, and Mordecai's trying to persuade her to go and speak to the king, which could mean she might get put to death for doing that, because you're not allowed to approach the king uninvited. And Mordecai says to Esther, "Look, either way, salvation is going to come for the Jews. So the question is, do you want to be part of the salvation? Do you want to have your chapter in the story of Jewish history?" And it's funny, in some ways you'd look at that as like not a particularly motivational talk, because it's like saying, no, don't worry, salvation's going to come either way. Like, we're totally optimistic about that. We're going to be fine. God's going to look after, God's going to save the Jews. So in some ways she could say, oh, I can relax then. But he's saying, no. Salvation is guaranteed, but do you want to fulfill what is potentially the purpose of your very being here? And if you don't do that, the world's going to be okay in the end. But what about you? What about your mission? What about your destiny? So I think that's the Jewish approach.
I'd say so. A person could say, though, if you take the Purim story, the Esther example, if you were to zoom out a little, it's her struggle to save the Jews in a very sad point in Jewish history. The Jews at the start of the Purim story are gone a bit off the boil and were overly involved in the Persian society and had to be saved and brought back. And then if you zoom out even further, just across Jewish history, it's filled with episodes of sadness and destruction and pain and suffering. In Bible times, the suffering of the forefathers, you've got the years enslaved in Egypt, the suffering in the desert afterwards. Then throughout the Nach, the prophets, the writings is filled with also the tough times of the Jews. And then wider Jewish history, crusades, expulsion, more recently the Holocaust. the Jewish history has been plagued with very tough times.
Yeah.
So whilst we've had room to be optimistic within small moments within that, couldn't persons have a very pessimistic view on Judaism based on our experience over the past few thousand years?
They could do. They definitely would have good reason to right now, standing back, looking back at Jewish history. I would say two things. The first thing I'd say is for a Jew today now, we are so... The Messianic era is imminent. And so I think we have much greater reason to be confident that that's something that can happen within our lifetime. And the age of...
why so? Is because we're not so oppressed right now? We have more freedoms nowadays? To be
why so
people?
What?
Would you say that the Messianic era is even more imminent?
Because the time's nearly up. It's got to happen by the year 6000. We're in the year 5... We just entered 5782.
Yeah.
God also has a track record for ending exiles early. So time really is running out now. So it's got to be any year, any day now. And I think also, the ghetto walls have come down. I think we're no longer in the age of strong, deep ideological hostility towards Jews as it was in the past. I think today we're in a different kind of crisis. It's one more of people are directionless and people are looking for, I don't think a lot of the anti-Semitism that we might see today, or honestly like violence or bad acts of badness, a lot of it I think just comes from lacking direction. We live in an age of foolishness, as some people call it, rather than an age of like deep-seated, like defiant evil. And so I think that in some ways should give us reason for optimism that we have the chance for the Jewish voice now to really come through. But if you were a Jew living 2,000 years ago, 100 years ago, 500 years ago, where did the optimism come? I think of Rabbi Akiva, who, when he saw the Talmud recalls that when he saw the destruction of the temple, his fellow rabbis were despairing, and he was laughing. And he said, there was a prophecy of the temple's destruction, but there was also a prophecy that's going to be rebuilt. Now, you could stand there and be like, okay, Rabbi Akiva, that's great, but that's not going to happen for quite a while. Although I don't think they necessarily knew that at the time. They didn't. I'm not sure how many. I don't know.
The first exile was 70 years. It was known that the second one would be longer. I don't know.
No, but I think this was the second one.
Yeah, the second one.
This was the second
one that's been no temple.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So like you could
fit.
Yeah, I think there was probably a sense that this is we're in for a bit of a long haul, but it's not necessarily the things are gonna. I think the optimism doesn't necessarily come from things are going to be all well and good in my lifetime, but it's that they will eventually. All human beings will be resuscitated, and there will be a perfect world. But I can be confident. So I can be confident that we'll get there in the end, even if it's not necessarily in my lifetime.
Okay.
But I think part of the mindset is understanding that everything that's happening along the way, including the destruction, is all part of a process, even the destruction itself, towards redemption, because God is a creator, not a destroyer. So even the things that, nothing bad, if bad means wasn't meant to happen, that's not Jewish. So it's understanding that, everything's part of a process leading towards a good outcome. And that's a psychological mindset that can allow someone to move forward, and also to understand that I can play my role in getting there to that promised land. And even though it may be very long and I might not get to the promised land myself, Rabbi Akiva saw that the happiness and fulfillment I can get in my lifetime, and the optimism I can feel, is that I know we're going to get there in the end. It might not be in my lifetime, but I can do my bit to continue to build the blocks of the first foundations of the third temple. So I think Jews who are unable to have a particularly nice existence get their sense of contentment or ability to push on through a deeper sense of, I have a job to do. And when you've got a job to do, and you're needed for something, for a purpose, you're actually able to forego or perhaps think a little bit less about the quality of one's existence because you're focused on your job. It's like if you've, the height of the coronavirus and your job as a doctor and you're rushing from patient to patient, you end up realizing, I haven't eaten since yesterday, or there's so many things, your existence almost becomes a little bit less when you're so focused on a job and it's so meaningful and it's so necessary and you're so needed, you actually find that the quality of your, not necessarily the small things, can be very uncomfortable.
Sure.
But you can get a bit more comfortable being uncomfortable because the soul sort of takes the lead.
So it sounds like it's a perspective on the situation. The situation itself is neither pessimistic or optimistic, or bad or good, happy or sad. Rather, it's one's approach within their current situation that can dictate whether they live a pessimistic or optimistic Jewish life. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah.
I'm also wondering, I'm thinking about, you've spoken about the broad picture of Jewish history. On a day-to-day Jewish life, people often complain that Judaism, and cry out that Judaism is filled with tons of seemingly unnecessary and very trivial laws and rules and regulations, what you can eat, what you can't eat. You've got to pray, you've got to wear certain, for many you have to wear tefillin, you've got to go to synagogue, not go to synagogue, build a sukkah, you've got to, clean your house full of bread for one part of the year and only eat a certain very not so flavorful kind of crackery thing. Our day-to-day life and our yearly existence is filled with responsibilities and burdens, some that can feel quite meaningful and some that can feel very trivial and at times annoying. Is the day-to-day Jewish existence, with the laws encroaching within it, could that be seen as an optimistic existence, or pessimistic, a happy or a sad, a pleasureful or a stressful and aggravating existence? How I don't know if I'm formulating my question as clearly.
I hear the question. What do you think?
What do I think? I've chosen to be the interviewer, so I have to get. I don't know. Look, I think your idea on perspective is very true. That all this kind of stuff can be seen as simply stuff. If you find it meaningful, like your example with the doctor and coronavirus, if you find the laws, the obligations, as they enhance your life, they're meaningful to you, you understand the purpose behind them, and they add to your life, then they can bring joy and meaning and purpose and fulfillment. However, if you're sitting there and you have no personal relationship with these things you have to do, you feel obliged and forced to show up to synagogue, you feel forced to eat this, you feel annoyed that you can't do that on the Sabbath day. If they don't mean anything to you, then it's obvious and it's easy for them to become just trivial, annoying things in the way.
What do you think can make them meaningful to someone?
A personal connection. I mean,
how does that happen?
It's often spoken about nowadays that the restrictions that people put on technology on Shabbat, that technology didn't exist 2,000 years ago, as we know it, for sure. And so phones, smartphones, social media, all these are very, very modern things. But due to the understanding of the rabbis when electricity started coming out, they decreed that all electricity devices and how people are against the laws of Shabbat, to activate and to use electricity, and therefore we've now found out that point being is we can't really use social media and phones and tech so much on Shabbat. So in the past few years, we've learnt how it's almost addiction and being enslaved to social media and technology can actually be harmful to our mental health, to our life, our enjoyment, and having a forced clean break one day out of 7 is incredibly helpful. Now, for people who have that problem with technology, and who didn't keep Shabbat growing up and were kind of enslaved with this, and now they introduce this idea of making a break from their busy working week, and they feel the benefits of having the ability to switch off and to get back in touch with themselves and their families and have real conversations and to have a level of self-introspection, to feel that personal benefit to them, all of a sudden makes the idea of having a break on Shabbat very meaningful to them.
Yeah.
This is an idea that could be so easily tapped into 100 years ago, 50 years ago.
So are you aware of the book, the Sefer HaChinuch?
Sefer HaChinuch, yeah.
So it came along about maybe like, I think around like 1,000 years ago. You correct me if I'm wrong. And what did it do?
Mm-hmm.
It came along to give reasons to help us understand the mitzvot.
13th century Spain.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right, come on.
Yeah.
I think that's good enough. So, and it was quite controversial because it was giving us reasons to help us understand why we do something and how it can enhance one's life. Why do you think it was controversial?
Well,
and why hadn't something come along sooner?
I guess. I want to the line which is
because you're giving plenty. You're trying to say here's people need to build a personal connection with the mitzvah and need to connect to it. So here's, for example, how I connect to Shabbat, and that, because it's like a time to switch off and that kind of stuff. And the Sefer HaChinuch in some ways was trying to do that. Here's, some good, compelling arguments, pragmatic reasons why the mitzvah can, how they benefit one.
Sure.
Why do you think it was controversial?
I mean, there's a distinction, I feel, between a reason and the reason. If you're told that a reason for me personally, me as Sam, that I find Shabbos very enjoyable is because I get to switch off from technology and it's better for my mental health and I give those sort of reasons as my reasons, that's fine. And you've got no problem with that. If I say to you that the reason that Shabbat is beneficial is so you can switch off,
but the Sefer
and it does, and you personally don't find that reason so compelling, then that bothers you.
But it began, I'm pretty sure, the book begins with the caveat that we are not presenting the reason. We're just presenting reasons. Perhaps. So why do you think it's so controversial? So
I don't know. Maybe people didn't listen to the caveat.
So let's imagine.
What do you say?
Let's imagine you're married, and your wife tells you, I don't like it when you leave the dining room chair like slightly to the side. And you say, why? Is that the right response?
I hear what you're saying.
No, is that the right response?
I mean, in what sense? Is it? I'm going to guess no.
So what is the right response?
In her eyes, it's not the right response.
Why is it not the right response in her eyes?
Because you're basically, by saying why, you're kind of putting a caveat that I will only do it if the reason that you want me to move the chair in this way makes sense to me.
Right, and what's the reason that should be a good enough reason?
That she wants it.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I hear that.
Now, the exact same thing applies with mitzvot. When God says, can you please do this? Can you please not use electricity on Shabbat?
Mm-hmm.
Can you please build a tent outside your house for 7 days of the year?
In English September.
And you say, why? Is that the right answer? If God comes to you and says that, or has God just given you a good enough reason, which is he asked you to do it?
For sure.
So
but is anything wrong with saying to one's wife, I'd be glad to move the chair in this direction? Of course, anything for you, honey. But for my own personal interests, would you tell me the reason as to why? Is that lowering the level?
Yes, it is. I think you can go there, but I think ultimately, if you really, if you're married to your wife, if this is your wife, her happiness and well-being is there should be of course there's going to be other reasons that may or may not be relevant, may or may not make sense to you. But there is, ultimately, you would agree, no greater reason or motivation than it's what she wants.
For sure.
Right?
Exactly. I don't think by asking why and accepting to do it, you're saying I'll only do it if it makes sense to me, then I understand how that's a big problem.
Yeah.
If you're saying I'll do it regardless, but I'd like to know why.
No, but what I'm saying is...
I don't find that unhealthy.
No,
I find that even more healthy.
No, what I'm saying is, if you're looking for how I can get a personal connection to something, or I can get meaning from something, for sure you can try and find that. There is no greater meaning or sense of personal connection one can get than I'm doing this because it means something to God.
But then, by that logic, couldn't you say that all mitzvot could either have deep, reasons to them, or just be completely random? There's a bunch of random sort of tasks in our lives that God's asked us to do, and by running over these hoops and doing all these random things, and doing them only because He's asked us to do them, therefore that shows our love. So, therefore, saying that a lot of the mitzvot, the fact that we build a hut and we eat matzah and keep Shabbat, are kind of meaningless. But the only meaning we have is that Hashem doesn't.
So that's not the Jewish view. I had once thought that, like, did God just pick at random? Okay, pig's not kosher. There's the Torah is, when God came down to Mount Sinai and revealed the Torah, he was actually revealing himself. It's the word revelation, right? Reveal,
Right.
to reveal.
Yeah.
So the Torah is God in written form. And so it's his essence. So Shabbos, the commentaries talk about the fact that he keeps Shabbat.
Okay.
He puts on to Moshe saw that God was wearing tefillin. Now, what does that tefillin mean? It's not literal. Okay, yeah, I know it's not literal. Well, actually, it is literal. But our tefillin is the metaphor for God's tefillin. Our hand is a metaphor for God's hand. We think God's the metaphor. No, he's the creator. So we're in his image. So he has a infinite hand, whatever that means, right? It's not physical. He has tefillin. So all the mitzvot are things that are meaningful to God, that God does himself. The commentary tells God keeps his laws. Mm-hmm. And so when he revealed himself, he said, this is me. And so by you doing this, I'm asking you to do this, which is in and of itself exceptionally meaningful and astounding that God in any way needs something from us. And so when you do a mitzvah, what you're basically saying to God is, I want to do what means you've asked me to do this, and I want to be with you. He's saying, when he came down to Mount Sinai, he said, I'm the Lord your God. And we often just, we should have brushed over that. Lovely, okay, you took you out of Egypt. He's saying, I am yours. I'm giving myself over to you. This is me in written, and I want to be yours. It was a marriage. So Mount Sinai was a marriage. And mitzvot, by us doing mitzvot, we're saying, and we will be yours. You can be ours. And so of course, finding meaning in other ways in which the mitzvot, prodding the depth of them and finding pragmatic ways in which they help. But the point is, even if we didn't have those things, there's nothing more meaningful than, if you want it, yes. And that was what Na'aseh v'nishma was. We will do and we will listen. God comes to you and says, can you do something for me? Yes. Because it means something. So it's not, and I think that is so, when you talk about burdens, responsibilities, I feel like the burden is lifted because, you have the choice whether to do it. It's not that you have to, and I don't even think that threats of punishment and that kind of stuff would work anymore today. I just think we graduated from that. I don't know. I just don't think people get so easily threatened by those things anymore. Instead, it's just what one ought to do. God is waiting, like just extending the hand, like saying, well, will you? And yeah, I think it's so much better to see it in those terms than a sense of pressure, a sense of obligation, just a sense of this means something to my creator.
Yeah, I think I've got this sort of fear that this is very high level we're describing, of this, not blind, but just such a deep trust and love of Hashem that to question him doesn't even come into the picture.
Oh, right. Why not? You've got to overcome that hurdle first. I agree.
I'm saying, but it's also, you can also very easily blur that with almost this blindness, this sort of lack of effort. To go like, I don't care for the reason. I don't want to work hard. I don't want to work it out. I don't want to try and tap myself as a mitzvah. So I just, if I'm told to do it, I'll do it. The books, instructions, follow A, follow B.
No. So
I think that in between that, in my abstract hierarchy, in between that, there is a healthy level of inquisitiveness. This is Hashem's wisdom. I want to learn more. I want to attach to it. I understand that I want to aim for this seemingly unattainable level to me of this just revelation, understanding. I just accept and not serve an ishma. But in order to get there, I've got to be pragmatic. I've got to accept that I've got to motivate myself. I've got to believe on my terms and feel on my terms that I want to do these mitzvot. And I've got to encourage myself, motivate myself along the way to get to this high, I will do and I will listen to Seven Ishma approach.
It's so funny because I'm actually feel the complete opposite. Look, of course, if one was to do this and engage in that, you'd need to, of course, accept certain premises that there is a God, that his Torah is his will, that kind of stuff.
Sure.
But let's say you accept those premises. First of all, I'm not against trying to understand the reasons and like understand the depth and the wisdom behind any mitzvah. That's fantastic, and it can absolutely enhance your thing. What I'm saying is, I don't think there's. I think the most meaningful thing you can do is, this is something that means something to him, right? And it's something that he needs of you. So it's and by the way, that is relation. That's a real relationship, which is the purpose of it. So if this means something to me, I can say about it. That's great. You can, feel very spiritually elevated, but where's the relationship? When you do it because it means a relationship, we know, really, like a strong, healthy relationship is when I do something because it makes my partner happy, and I'm doing it for them. So if I'm doing it because this gives that's great if it can get you there. But I also feel that for me instinctively this is. I find it much more beautiful and easy to connect to than trying to find reasons why it makes sense to me, because I used to have an approach where it's kind of like I would explain rationally why one needs to do this, and one, if I don't do this, then it could have like spiritual consequences and all those kind of things. But it's actually very self-serving, and when you do that. When you treat
how does it help me?
When you treat mitzvot as self-serving, that's miserable. At least I found that to be, because it's not a relationship. It can only be a relationship if it means something to him. And I was taught for a bit that God doesn't have any emotions or needs or anything like that, it doesn't actually. It's only for your benefit. This is just for you. You're the needy one. You're the one, and that just really. So basically, you end up treating mitzvot as like this kind of game almost, and it's just like it felt detached from relationship, and so it's. I personally relate, like, of course, as you know, I love learning, I love teaching, all that kind of stuff, but I find the approach of this is something I'm being asked to do, and it means something to him, rather than thinking about what can I gain from this. It's healthy, and it's what a real relationship is. There's a story of a girl that went up to a rabbi once and said, "Rabbi, I don't usually go to the mikveh. I've never been before, actually, but like I'm thinking of maybe going now. Like, I think it was before her wedding or something." And she said, "But like, am I gonna feel like religious afterwards? Like, I don't want to become that. Like, it's just not really my whole vibe." She's like, "Well, what am I going to feel afterwards?" And he goes, "You're probably going to feel wet." And he was like, so what he's basically saying is, you don't need to expect that you're going to feel a big, deep spiritual high after doing any particular mitzvah in order for it to be meaningful. It's meaningful to him, and that is enough for me, at least, that is incomparably powerful, and we know it works in relationships. How did I feel after doing the shopping for my wife or for my mum or for, I don't feel like I've really done something good. In fact, it was quite annoying, actually. Fine, that doesn't matter. You made her happy. You made her life a bit easier. Why does it have to be all about you? And so so we should see Jewish rituals less about. We shouldn't really call it rituals. We should call it service. Because rituals implies, I'm going to get some big spiritual high, and no, in the same way that you might not. And sometimes people really do feel things, and that's great. But sometimes doing something for your friend or for your wife or your husband or your parents or whatever can be an annoyance, or it's just a thing you do, and just knowing it's made their life a bit easier is good enough. And
yeah, I mean, you also have to accept that the common claim against a pure altruistic altruistic deeds is that it's always a bit for you. People are always a bit selfish in some sense, that yes, you're doing it for someone else because you feel better by doing it. You can't fully escape, I'd say, the self-centered, not self-centered, but a level of ego within that. I don't think that's bad at all. I don't think that's unhealthy. I also don't think that's avoidable.
I think sometimes you can get.
But your emphasis here is not that it's me, me, me. Your emphasis here is this is what Hashem wants.
Yes, and ironically, yes, if you want to play the game in terms of that makes you happy. Yeah. We actually are happier when we're less focused on our needs, because when we focus on our needs, they're endless, and you're never satisfied.
Well, let's talk about happiness for a bit. Just a neat transition. Broad question: how would you define happiness?
First of all, I'd like to caveat everything we're about to discuss in the happiness thing by saying this is not something I always excel at.
What, happiness or defining happiness?
Happiness,
okay.
and like a work, it's a challenge, a work in progress, and I don't want to feel like I'm kind of standing on some kind of pedestal. I really, it's a challenge. But I think happiness is defined very clearly by our sages. In Pirkei Avot, they say, "Who is happy? He or she who is content with their lot."
Actually, it says who's wealthy.
Who is
wealthy.
Yeah, sorry, but I think that's also applying to happiness.
Yes,
I think it's talking about happiness as well.
But being content and pleased with what one has.
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of it comes down to, I think it's a two-pronged approach. I think part of it is about expectations.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of it's just about headspace, focus. So if you're focused on, your mission and your impact on the world and what you're doing, then your headspace is going to be taken up by doing good things. Whereas if your headspace is focused on, things you don't have or one's own needs, then it can, sometimes it's necessary, but it can, affect one's happiness and sense of contentment. But I think all this ties back to the same principle of like, where is your focus? And who is happy with their lot, which means their focus is on. It's just mindset.
They're not focusing on wanting more. Their focus is on their lot and their goal and their job and their situation.
Yeah, focus on.
Are you familiar, by the way, with the World Happiness Report?
No.
Heard of this? It's I think it's published by the UN, and it's I think it comes out. I think they do it yearly, but often the Scandinavian countries seem to come out very highly, and the UK seems to come out quite low. In fact, I think it's UK and America. Often the wealthiest countries in the West seem to come out quite low, and I'm not sure what it is about Scandinavian countries that they historically seem to thrive in it. But I looked it up. Just a lot of data and graphs, but I looked up actually the variables that they use, the criteria that they define their happiness reports, and I want to see, compare that to maybe a more Jewish point of view. According to their website, they say there are 6 key variables: income, a person's income; freedom, a person's trust in government; if they have a healthy life expectancy, and if they have social support from family and friends, and also generosity, if they feel like they are a generous person. And they put together those 6 things. They try and score the average person in that country on those 6 things and define sort of, on average, how happy a person is in those nations. And they're not poor criteria by any definition. I think in many areas they hit the nail on the head. And they are often linked to sort of purpose and goal and satisfaction and headspace. But my first approach was they feel quite sort of limited, quite sort of almost basic in a way, because they leave out a more divine, world, global, or bigger than oneself purpose, a greater purpose in community and mankind and the world as we know it. I also thought about, it's an idea that I often heard in Aish Torah. I believe that the late Rav Noach Weinberg, of blessed memory, who founded Aish Torah in Jerusalem, often spoke about happiness and pleasure. He made the point that I'm combining ideas I've heard in his name and from his students, that an Eskimo has about 60 words in their language for snow. Why? Because when you're surrounded by snow, you have to become sort of an expert in different kinds of snow, thin snow, thick snow, right? So they have all different words. In Judaism, we have a ton of words about happiness. We have simcha, gila, ditza, and they all have different sort of meanings to them. Then why does Judaism, why does Hebrew, the whole language, Lashon HaKodesh, God's language, have so many different words that are different aspects of happiness? Because maybe happiness and joy is a key part of our Yiddishkeit, and maybe we have a responsibility to become experts, connoisseurs in happiness and pleasure. Rav Noach often used to describe human beings as pleasure seekers. He said the way that you could sort of identify the purpose of an object is by its function. So a pen, if you pick it up, it can be a back scratcher, it can turn on light switches with an extended arm, but its best function is to be used as a pen. Human beings do a lot of stuff, but at the core of all the things that we do, we're trying to find a certain level of pleasure. Therefore, we are, by design, pleasure seekers. So we have this sort of basic pre-programmed position of trying to seek out pleasure, and Judaism is filled with different kinds of pleasure, happiness, and joy, and richness. I heard a definition from Rav Gabriel Friedman, who you've interviewed on JTV, on the roof of Torah, over in an amazing sunny day overlooking the Western Wall. And it's quite, I remember because you got like nice, snazzy sunglasses, both of you, which I think is quite a cool image. But he defined it as happiness is the feeling that one gets when they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. Like, first, you've got to, I guess, assess and assume and work out what is it you want to be doing, and then by doing that, that'll bring happiness. In fact, it's very reminiscent of the opening of Messias Yesharim, a book put out by Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the Ramchal, about character traits, development, and growth. And a person must first identify their role, their unique role in this world, and then do that. And that's how they will bask in the joy and the throne of God, the ultimate happiness. Another famous age class was, and you said before we recorded today, you have some issues with this one. It's the 5 levels of pleasure. A very famous Rav Noach class, very famous age class, still taught today. And the essence of the class is building up levels of pleasure. It starts at the most basic level, a very physical level of pleasure, like a chocolate cake. Tastes nice, it's enjoyable when you're having it, but it's fleeting. You don't remember the chocolate you had yesterday that much because, it's cake, you moved on. And you go up, you add some love and meaning and construction and giving, and there are different levels of pleasure. I can't remember the exact order off the top of my head. But do you remember what the highest level of pleasure is? And honestly, they end the class, they mention it, end the class, and everyone goes out for lunch.
Relationship with God.
Relationship with God, yeah, transcendence, a relationship with God. The highest level we should strive for is not the material things or the more meaningful things we can find in this world, but to rise above that, to find some sort of relationship with God.
Yeah.
In writings I've read about, in preparation for this podcast, about is Judaism an optimistic, pessimistic religion? If you were to analyse it from an external point of view, the Jewish struggle, the Jewish life, the Jewish history is plagued with just suffering and pain and anguish and anxiety and just stress. I don't know if you ever read Rav Joseph B. Soloveitchik's book, Lonely Man of Faith. But it's basically battling with this inner struggle of man, of the struggles of man in this world, and then a sense of responsibility to connect to their creator and all the struggles within that. And it's lonely and it's tough and it's painful. Jewish life can be really, really tough. Some of the lines I've read in certain pieces of writing I found sort of said that it's obvious to a person that by looking externally at Judaism, you can't say it's anything but a pessimistic, almost unenjoyable existence. Except, and a lot of these writings seem to conclude, however, the ultimate goal, the ultimate thing is to connect with the Creator. If we have that connection with the Creator, that is the ultimate pleasure. If we were to get there and reach that high level, then all the suffering would make sense. Our purpose would make sense, and it wouldn't be in vain, and we'd enjoy that real happiness, that real pleasure. I feel like I've gone in so many different random directions in the past minute.
No, it's totally coherent. I'll tell you what I thought was my only issue with the whole thing about talking about being very focused on pleasure when you talk about trying to be happy and that kind of thing is because to achieve what he's talking about, or Rabbi was talking about, and what we're saying is the highest level of pleasure. The point is you need to stop focusing on your own pleasure. It's like a bit of a
it's a catch-22.
Yeah, it's a catch-22.
Yeah.
If you're focused on how much pleasure am I getting, that's not gonna that won't work. So the point is, if you frame it as pleasure seeking, that if you frame your Judaism and your meaning and everything as about how much pleasure am I going to get, it's a totally wrong-headed approach, because actually I'm less skeptical about the whole can people be altruistic. I think that's when we really thrive, is when we actually drop a focus on our quality of existence. And I'm really no one to talk on this. I'm just talking purely, in principles. Rabbi Manis Friedman gave a TED talk about he called it the meaning of life. And he makes a distinction between the quality of one's existence and the quality of one's life. Existence is my, material wealth, the comfort that I have in my life, the things that, that affect me or make my life easier, so to speak. And then life is something that cannot be taken away from one for as long as one has breath in their body, which is our ability to make moral decisions, to relate to a higher purpose, to impact other people, and just to actually just be happy and enjoy existing, being present in today, and also making space for others and sharing your existence with others. And as he said, the quality of people's existence can change, it can vary, but the quality of one's life cannot. And you referenced earlier that happiness data. It's fairly safe to say that you have far higher levels of depression and unhappiness in more wealthy first world countries than you do in third world countries. And I think part of that is down to levels of expectation about their existence. They have a far lesser existence, so it's almost like they've given it up to some extent and they just focus instead on living. Whereas here we have far higher expectations of quality of existence, and therefore higher demands, and also some people that have very high quality of existence and they're not focused on the living part, the life part, the meaning part. So actually existence without life, it's quite empty, and that also can be another reason for misery. But you spoke also about the Jewish experience and it being very difficult and painful and tragic. We're reading the final parshas of the Torah at the moment, and the final few parshas, Moses is talking to the Jewish people, and he's saying, "You're gonna, they're standing at the brink of the promised land. You're about to enter it, but I'm afraid to tell you, you're not going to be here long. You're going to get exiled, scattered. You're going to have a very miserable time. Things are going to be difficult, painful. You're going to get persecuted. The quality of your existence is going to be really, really difficult as God's chosen people." So what he's actually saying is, then he says those words, choose life. And he said to focus on living for the higher purpose, for meaning, for connection to, clinging to mitzvot as your cause and your mission. And that's what it really means when he says choose life. He's saying, my strong recommendation to you as God's chosen people who have to go through a very bitter existence for a couple of thousand years for whatever reason that we can't perhaps understand fully, he's saying, maybe give up your existence a little bit, give up a strong attachment to it, strong expectations of it, and instead focus on living. And as I say, this is something that I struggle with massively, and the Jewish ideal absolutely is to have both a high quality of existence and a high quality of living, and we believe that's going to be the messianic, that will be the messianic era, of course, and that should be something everyone has every right to aspire to. But the point is, while we're still not there, and I think it probably makes sense that that's what would be required of God's chosen people, because the purpose of the Jewish people is for us to bring godliness into the world. And therefore, it's not surprising that if our job is to bring the spiritual into a physical, we're going to be forced throughout our history to become a little bit detached, or a bit detached to the physical world, to physical existence, because we're asked to transcend that, to bring God into the world. For whatever reason, that's the way it needs to work for him. And that sort of has been the incredible story of the Jewish people, that they've shown how, according to the laws of nature, according to the laws of history, according to the laws of nations' history, it makes no sense for Jews to be here. It makes no sense for them to continue to thrive, given all the pain and suffering and dispersion that they've been through. But the point is that that's the whole purpose of God's chosen people, is to be a people that transcend the physical world. I heard it said quite beautifully that God, in creating the world, he turns nothing into something. And our job as his people is to turn something back into nothing. And when nothing, I don't mean nothing. I mean the physical into spiritual, meaning to reveal godliness even in the spiritual, even in the physical world.
Let's move on to putting this all together. The ideas of perspective, pessimism, optimism, happiness, pleasure, purpose. To the question, which is, what is Sukkot all about? Or Sukkot, or tabernacles. We have just, tomorrow night is the first night of Sukkot, when we move from our wonderful homes into our hopefully wonderful but more temporary homes with leaves on our roof. We've just come back out of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, only a few days ago. And 10 days before that, we had Rosh Hashanah, the start of the year. Now, these are days which are very serious days of self-introspection and trying to reattach ourselves to our Creator, put Hashem, God, in front of us as the King once more, to reaffirm Him as the King in our lives. Where we think back about all our deeds that we've done over the past year, and will be put into the book of life, or the book of death, or do we have a good year, a bad year? Can we atone for our sins? Can we ask for forgiveness from our fellow man and from Hashem? Can we get to that level? And then we have those days, very intense days, and then we transition only a few days later into Sukkot, a festival with two main mitzvot, two main sort of commandment laws. One is to live in this temporary home of Sukkot for 7 days, and the other one is to shake some random bits of palm branch and a citrus fruit, the love and the etrog.
God, we are weird.
We are a weird bunch. So in light of the things we discussed so far, Ollie, what is Sukkot all about?
What's it all about? I can't tell you what it's all about.
I'll say one
as we discussed earlier, we don't know we can't know all the reasons.
And but my transition into this is that the term that we give for Sukkot in our prayers is a Zman Simchatenu, a time of simcha, happiness, joy. And yet we're sitting in a hut shaking some leaves around. So yeah, in light of all of that, what is Sukkot?
Well, the Torah actually gives it says you should dwell in huts for 7 days because you dwelled in. I'm paraphrasing slightly, but it says because you dwelled in Sukkot when you left Egypt.
Yes.
Now,
our forefathers dwelled in sort of huts and deserts post Egypt before they entered the land of Israel. Yeah.
Now, interestingly, Rabbi David Foreman talked about. He has a great video series on Sukkot, and he says it's interesting how when it comes to Shavuot and Pesach, Passover, they both commemorate a certain moment in time. The giving of the Torah, Mount Sinai, the exodus from Egypt, whereas Sukkot is less about a particular moment in time. It's actually about sort of a thing that we did, right, throughout 40 years in the wilderness. But he says, actually, interestingly enough, you could read the verse where it says you should dwell in Sukkot because you dwelled. I'm slightly paraphrasing. I need to double check. It says because you dwelled in Sukkot when you left Egypt. And he said, he noticed something really interesting. Where was the first geographic place the Jews went to when they left Egypt? You know what it was called?
Is it called Sukkot?
Yes.
Yeah.
So he said is it possible that it's actually talking, when it says you dwelled in Sukkot, it's actually talking about that place we first dwelled in on the very first night after we left Egypt? Could that be another way of reading it? And what's he trying to? Of course, it can be both. It can be both the 40 years in the wilderness, but also perhaps that moment, that night. He said, if you think about it, imagine what it must have felt like that night. We've been in Egypt for hundreds of years. Yes, it was a horrible existence, but it's what we knew. And suddenly we're being asked, we're following, God basically into the desert. We're living in these very poorly constructed and slightly fragile tents under the night sky in the desert, with all our cattle and our kids, and we're, one might feel a little bit vulnerable in a different kind of way, like, what now? What happens now? And the theme of Sukkot, of us reliving that experience of being out in the desert, perhaps on that first night, or perhaps throughout our time in the wilderness, and we talk about the quality of our existence, being a little bit more uncomfortable, being out in the open, outside, not in the comfort of our house, and having a roof where you can see a little bit into the night sky, and it's not so, it doesn't, it might not, well, in terms of the quality of one's existence, yes. And what it's trying, I think the theme of Sukkot is one of trust. It's like, as we were saying earlier in Moses' speech, the Jew does not rely on physical security, and the Jew doesn't rely on the quality of their existence throughout our history to be always a constant static, 10 out of 10. But what keeps us going, what we do feel we can always rely on, and what Sukkot is asking of us to remember, is our reliance on God and His taking care of us. And therefore, that's the theme of Sukkot. I think that's what I think it's getting at. We've gone through the rebuilding the relationship, reaffirming the relationship through the High Holy Days, and now we enter Sukkot, and we affirm that trust that should keep us going throughout the year. Interestingly, what is the opposite of trust?
What opposite of trust?
Yeah, what happens when
lack of trust?
Yeah,
better English word for it.
Yeah. How can I trust you? How can I know? It kind of
betrayal. Yeah.
Betrayal. It's really, and this I think is the ultimate enemy of happiness. Actually, when we're talking about happiness, all anxieties, all discontent comes down to one thing: fear. That's what actually animates a lot of human activity. It's what animates a lot of human insecurities, a lot of human discontent. It's a worry, fear. Am I going to be okay? Is this enough? Will I? All these concerns of one's own well-being, they are all ultimately rooted in fear. I've always felt like, imagine if one knew what the transition was going to be like from living to dying, and they knew what heaven, they were living in this world, and they knew what the experience of heaven was going to be like, and they also knew very clearly what God spoke to them and what their mission was in this world, and they felt a sense of God's looking after them, and I think you'd be very secure. One would feel very secure. You're not going to be frightened by death because you know what's to come.
Sure.
You know what your job is. You feel looked after by God, and that's all. And it would be relatively straightforward. People are prepared to go through challenge and exertion and discomfort when they know it's for a good cause, especially when it's for an infinite cause. The challenge that we have is that our memory of being in heaven has been zapped, and we don't have God speaking to us directly as we once did at Mount Sinai. And things are a little bit, we live in a world in which God hides his face. And so trust is much harder, and fear the potential to be stronger. And the work of Sukkot and the work of Judaism throughout every aspect of it is to build a strong sense of trust. And the stronger the trust becomes, the lesser the fear is. And the lesser the fear is, the more one feels happy and content. I think fear is the root of all kinds of anxiety, shame, anger, just general worry, jealousy, insecurities. A lot of this just comes down to fear of one's own sense of self. Will I be okay? Without this, I think that's the root. And yeah, I just think it's actually one of the most common things that God says in the Torah is do not fear. If we didn't have fear...
Yeah.
Sorry?
So you can read that also into the trilogy of festivals that we're in right now.
Yeah.
That Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are the days where we reaffirm that trust, that faith in God. And once we've developed that, then we can be vulnerable in Sukkot, but whilst have the ultimate level of joy, of simcha, of pleasure, of happiness. Yeah. Because we've got that trust, we've established that. And if we were to enter Sukkot without developing that trust, it wouldn't work the same way. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think it's important to clarify to listeners that Judaism in no way glorifies physical pain and suffering. We want to do everything we can to alleviate it, and God also hates it. The Gemara says that every day God regrets creating evil, he regrets creating exile, he regrets it, he hates it, he doesn't like it. For some reason, he needs humanity to temporarily go through it, but our job is in no way just to say, oh, okay, no, that's fine, that's the reason. No, our job is actually to be as discomforted as God is, and to be partners with him in alleviating it.
But don't you need pain and suffering and evil to exist? Otherwise you don't appreciate and recognise the difference between that and good and kindness and pleasure and happiness. You can't know what a good film is unless you've ever seen a bad film.
It would seem temporarily humanity needs it, but not eternally, no. For some reason, it was required, according to certain views of reading the Adam and Eve story, which we're also coming up to soon. That was something that was actually needed of them to eat from the tree, to enter the world of pain and darkness and God hiding his face. But it is not the world that God desires ultimately. And we don't glorify it, and we want a world totally free of suffering, and a world in which both the quality of our existence and the quality of our life is perfect.
Cool. I'm wondering actually if that might be a good place to leave it.
Yeah.
Unless you've got any sort of...
no, I think that's quite a nice way to stop.
A nice sort of very thought on Sukkot.
Enough thoughts. I'll tell you actually I've got one last thought that I thought of myself actually.
The floor is yours.
Yeah. I'll tell you one final thing I thought of myself a few years ago, and I was wondering, is there any obviously there is, but I'm trying to make sense. Actually, let me start that again. One final thing I'd just share about Sukkot is I sometimes think, what is the direction of travel that we go on as we go through the different festivals, the different chagim, Torah-mandated chagim, throughout the year. So, according to there are two New Years. There's a New Year for humanity, which begins on Rosh Hashanah, but the Jewish people, the Jewish style, is actually Nisan, begins in Passover. So let's start there. So you start with Passover, which is the time of, we call the Zaman Cherutenu, the time of our freedom. Mm-hmm. Then we go to Shavuot, which is the Zaman Matan Toratenu, the time of the giving of the Torah. Mm-hmm. Then we go to Rosh Hashanah, the Day of Judgment. Then we go to Yom Kippur, the Day of Forgiveness. And then we go to Sukkot, which is Zaman Simchatenu, the time of our happiness. And I think one of the things that I'm excluding the rabbinic festivals. But I think one of the messages that we're being taken on here is this is actually perhaps the journey of life. You enter this world, you're given free will, freedom, Passover. You begin your journey out of Egypt, and then you're given the Torah, which is our collective national mission, but also everyone has their own personal mission. You've got to use your free will to actualize that. Then everyone has their own personal day of judgment once they've completed their mission in this world. Then they have a sort of a spiritual cleansing process on Yom Kippur. And actually, if you look at the liturgy that we say, it's very much related to like a heavenly kind of introspection, coming to terms with one's own life. And then Sukkot, I think, is very emblematic of Olam Haba, the next world, which actually we ultimately believe will be back down here on Earth. But this idea of achieving, of arriving, I think that's Sukkot is, in some ways, there's actually lots of, I think, symbolism connected to the Garden of Eden in the Sukkah. I've read some of that, and it's very much about, it's very relationship oriented, and it's about.
Oh, on Garden of Eden, I'm pretty sure that the fruit that we believe that Adam and Eve ate was not an apple, as often depicted.
There's a few different opinions.
But I think one of the main opinions is that it was an etrog.
I've never heard etrog.
No?
I've heard grapes. I've heard fig.
I might be mistaken, but
no, it could be. It may well be. But either way, that it's. I think that's the journey it's taking us on. So Sukkot is like it's a time of your happiness because it's a time of achieving. It's also, they compare the 3 festivals, Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, to the process of a relationship. Passover is the engagement, God extending His hand to us. Shavuot is the marriage, and then Sukkot is the moving in together. So it's really about being at home with God. The Sukkah is it's about feeling at home with Him. So yeah, happy Sukkot.
Happy Sukkot. Hope you have
happy
a wonderful.
is the right word.
Happy. Very good, mate. Very, very good.